This is what the Fulda Gap looks like at 8:30 in the evening in the month of May, 1991. That village you see there looking northeastwards is the famous village of Hünfeld. Actually more of a small town, but has a couple of quite nice Gasthäuser and a couple of nice restaurants. It's just a very few kilometers from what was once the East German border. On beyond in the misty distance there would be what used to be East Germany and is today the Bundesstaat of Thüringen or Thuringia. You can see looking around the horizon that there's not a lot of really rugged mountains here, but it's all gently rolling hills. The gap of the Fulda Gap is really the area between the Vogelsberg Mountain, which is out of sight from this point, in that direction, southwesterly from here, about 20 miles or so at least. And then in the opposite direction, towards the southeast and even just a little bit east, the Hohe Rhön, the Rhön Mountains, a good bit higher. Again, I don't believe there's any one point here in the middle of the so-called Fulda Gap where you can see both of those higher and more rugged mountains that define what the gap is. It's simply a bit of more open terrain through which runs a trade route that's been used for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's a standard route from the east, from Dresden and points east, through Erfurt, Weimar, Jena, and then down here through Fulda and into the Kinzig River Valley, which flows down to Frankfurt and ultimately to Paris. But anyway, this is typical Hessian terrain in this German state of Hesse. And for 40 years, the United States Army had as its primary task the planning of the defensive battle in this very sector right here. In the real world, the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment would certainly have known every square inch and every hill that you see around you here. That now, of course, has become the most famous unfought battle in history. Well, this ought to be familiar terrain. We're just about 3 kilometers east of Schlitz. This is what the Fulda River looks like. Those hills that you see to the east there are where the Soviet attackers would be coming through. This open river valley immediately to your front would be your killing ground right in front of your main battle area. And your main battle area would commence on those hills right over there, just west of the Fulda River. So now you know what it looks like. In Phase 4, of course, you'll be counterattacking back in that direction and quite a ways beyond, we hope. And from a bit farther over on the banks of the river, this is what it looks like. What's left of our loyal cavalry regiment would be coming back across this, doing a passage of lines to get back to safety. Swinging on around here to the north, again, you can see the open area in front of our main battle area. Right now we are at the Flot, the front line of troops, according to our Phase 3 scenario, otherwise known as what used to be the Iron Curtain, otherwise known as what used to be the East German border, otherwise known as what used to be the Death Strip, right along here. Right now all that has changed. The barricades have been removed, the road is wide open. You can still see the guard tower here by the road with the German flag, the Bundesrepublik's flag flying over it. The only vehicle parked up there is a batch of tourists just like us checking out this particular area. I will, of course, have to walk across this boundary to show you that it can be done. And 2 years ago, this would certainly not have been possible. And right now, all this is the boundary between the German states of Hessen and Thüringen, Thuringia. sign here that shows you the state boundary gives a hint that there are still a few differences between the laws of the different states. There's a speed limit on the Autobahn, for example, when you get to it, 100 kilometers per hour. And right below that is an indication that the drunk driving laws in the eastern states are a lot more strict than they are in the west. The tolerance for alcohol, as you can see, is 0.00%. And so some of the old laws, well, some people think they might be worth keeping and worth having. But anyway, this is the boundary. Again, today it's simply the boundary between two German Bundesstaaten, federal states. So things have changed a bit. The only battle ever fought directly in the Fulda Gap happened right here, and it only lasted about 45 seconds. Right now we're about 6 kilometers east of the village of Hohenfeld, and we're looking back towards Hohenfeld. And about this same time, about 7:30 in the morning of the 4th of July, 1866, a squadron of Bavarian cavalry, the 1st Cuirassier Regiment, the lead unit, the reconnaissance unit of a 5,000-man cavalry division under the Prince of Taxis, was headed this direction. The entire division was in column on this road back behind Hohenfeld. They had been detached from the main Bavarian army many dozens of miles eastward on the other side of the Hohe Rhön mountain in order to come over here and to link up with the Bavarian allies, the Western German 8th Corps. Anyway, the 8th Corps was nowhere to be seen, and these Bavarian cavalry were feeling rather lonesome. It was a foggy morning. They were moving through unknown territory. They were not doing a particularly good job at reconnaissance. They were moving in this direction, heading towards the east, and they knew that their Prussian enemies were out here somewhere. Indeed, the lead elements of General von Bayer's Prussian division were heading towards them, and right about this spot, over here in this direction, some Prussians and a section of Prussian horse artillery could dimly be seen through the mists. The horse artillery unlimbered. The Bavarians had a section of guns with them also, and they opened fire on the Prussians through the fog with no effect. The Prussian guns returned fire, fired 2 shots. The first of them took the head off of a Bavarian cavalryman, and that was all it took to panic the entire regiment. What then happened was that the regiment panicked, galloped back towards Hohenfeld as fast as they could go. The entire remainder of the division, the rest of the 5,000 horsemen, were all in column on the road, and when this lead unit reached that column, it triggered off a panic of the entire division. What happened was one of the great and unglorious routs of military history. The 5,000 cavalry simply galloped until their horses were ready to drop, dozens of miles back, south, and then east, towards what they thought would be the safety of their own homeland. They finally slowed down to a walk, continuing to move, and then later in the day, a mad rumor set off yet another panic and another gallop. Not one of the finer moments of the Bavarian cavalry. But those few brief artillery rounds made up the only real military engagement ever fought directly in the Fulda Gap area. And this was an awkward way for the Bavarians to open this campaign of 1866. The Bavarian army had taken up positions to defend the crossings over the Saale River in the northern part of their country. That hill you see in the distance is part of the Hohe Rhön district. And it was over those hills that the Prussians, the lead Prussian division of General von Goeben, would descend down here to the resort town of Bad Kissingen to engage the Bavarians in battle here. The Saale River, as you can see, is a fairly significant one. The town today, as then, is a popular resort and spa area. Only one Bavarian brigade was at this very point, that of General Ribaud-Pierre of General Zoller's division. His other brigade was further downstream at Hammelburg, several miles. The remaining 3 divisions of the Bavarian army were further back to the southeast, within what should have been easy reinforcing distance if they were summoned in expeditiously. We'll see how well that all worked. But in any case, the Prussians had to descend to this point and cross this river. The bridges had been destroyed by the Bavarian defenders on what, from our viewpoint, is this left bank. One brigade of Prussians under General Kummer came down here to engage in a firefight with the Bavarians across this river right around here. The other brigade under General Wrangel went further downstream, found a partially destroyed bridge a mile or so in that direction, looted every house within a mile for lumber, rendered it crossable or usable, and crossed the Sala, coming into Bad Kissingen from the south, the direction we're looking. And this was about 1100 hours on the morning of the 10th. That brigade then swept into the town from the south, having outflanked these defenders. The Bavarians were not really prepared either in training or psychologically for a house-to-house city defense. They did put up a pretty good fight in the streets, but they were evicted from the city itself after about an hour's fighting. One particular man took a bit more evicting. He had barricaded himself in the room of one of these hotels, refused to listen to orders to withdraw, was able to wound about 13 Prussian soldiers from his window before the Prussians were able to break into the hotel through a side door and corner him in his room. "Nimm pardon," they cried. "Take pardon, surrender." "Nicht vom Preußen," not from the Prussians, he insisted. They kicked the door down and bayoneted him to death. Most of the other Bavarians, though, had been evicted by that time. They passed out of the city to the east, and it's to there that we can now go for another dramatic episode. The city cemetery of Bad Kissingen lies just off the main road running out of the town towards the east. And again, it was along that main road that the Bavarian defenders of Ribaud-Pierre's brigade moved as they were evicted from the town by the Prussians. Not all of them chose to leave so easily, however. And in this cemetery, with its walls and its single gateway, a stubborn defense took place. The Bavarian captain Thoma, with 300 men of the 15th Royal Bavarian Regiment, chose to make this cemetery into a kind of a Bavarian Alamo and to make their stand in here. It was a good place for defense. Their bravery could not be questioned, but their site selection might be, because after all, this whole position could be bypassed. But still, sooner or later, they would have to be evicted from it, and indeed the Prussians had to do just that. The battle for this cemetery then took place about 1 o'clock in the afternoon of 10 July. The Prussian attackers were men of the 15th, 53rd, and 55th Westphalian regiments of the Prussian army, a task force commanded by a Major von Birking. What they had to do is to either cross the walls or break their way in through the gateway and then do hand-to-hand combat among the tombstones, forcing the defenders towards the west, back down towards the church at the other end of the cemetery. This monument here in the cemetery says that from the Battle of Kissingen, 10 July 1866, here rest the valiant sons of the fatherland fallen in that battle. And it's worth mentioning that both Bavarians and Prussians lie buried here in close proximity to each other. These are a few of the markers that are still here today. Captain Varnberg, for example, wounded on July 10th, died of his wounds 9 days later, 39 years old. The Prussian Major and Battalion Commander August Rodewald, one of the highest ranking Prussian officers to die in this battle. The hand-to-hand combat among these tombstones lasted for about a half hour. By the time it ended, out of the 300 Bavarian defenders, 161 men had been taken prisoner. Only about 40 of them were able to escape, and the rest, about 100 men, were killed in this battle. Among the latter, Captain Thoma himself had been mortally wounded, died very shortly thereafter. We're looking back towards the village of Winkel, just this side of Bad Kissingen. And by 2 o'clock in the afternoon of the day of battle, the Bavarian brigade had retreated through that town up into the direction of these hills, which form a sort of a U-shape or horseshoe overlooking Winkels on the east and north. The Osterberg in this direction, and then the even higher Sindberg north of the town, which you are now looking at. And as you can see, this is an awfully strong defensive position, not for one battered brigade though. By 2 o'clock, however, another of the Bavarian divisions under General Fader showed up, took position on these hills, and was immediately, however, assaulted by Goebbels' attacking Prussians. They were not yet exhausted. They still had plenty of fight. They knew that they had to expand their perimeter at the Bad Kissingen bridgehead, and they attacked vigorously up these slopes. They were able to push Fader's division off of these hills, back beyond them to the next town of Nödlingen on the far side of this little pass here. By 4 p.m. then, the Prussians, exhausted about that time in the day, had taken these heights. They were ready to see the day come to an end. They had done quite a bit. The battle, however, was not over. The Prussians assumed their defensive positions in these hills, facing on beyond to the east. But between 5 and 6 p.m., a 3rd Bavarian division arrived, General Stephan's division, from the direction of Minnerstadt, where he had been in reserve all day. It formed up that late in the day and launched a massive counterattack, catching the Prussians by surprise. Only one of the 2 Prussian brigades was lined up on these hills. The other one was defending the remainder of the bridgehead. General von Wrangel then was hard-pressed, was driven off these hills temporarily. But then he did the same sort of thing that Colonel Chamberlain did at Little Round Top when faced by a similar situation. Simply fixed bayonets and counterattacked. Just as at Little Round Top, this late evening surprise, about 7 o'clock in the evening, paid off. The Bavarians were, for the second time, driven from these hills. The tired but victorious Prussians managed to recapture them, and against all odds, held on then at the end of the day. General von Goebbels' men had fought against 2.5 times their own number of opponents. But those opponents had attacked piecemeal. First a single brigade in the city, then one division, and then later another division. It had been a long and difficult battle, but there was never quite more than what the Prussians were able to handle. By the time the sun set, the Bavarians were in full retreat towards Schweinfurt. The bridgehead had been captured. Remaining a 2nd Prussian division then came down from the Hohe Rhön to cross into Bad Kissingen and to confirm this bridgehead and to prepare for a follow-up on the next day. On July the 14th, 1866, this spot just east of Aschaffenburg had a railroad passing through it, but unlike what you see here today, it was just a single track line at that time. This was the point east of Aschaffenburg where the Austrian division of Prince Alexander's 8th Corps made its stand to defend against the attacking Prussians of General von Goebbels' division. As so often in this campaign, the Austrians had to fight all by themselves. The Hessian division, which had been beaten at Laufach one day earlier, had already decided to go elsewhere and gave no support whatsoever to these troops that were in this area. There was an artillery battery on that hill that you can see in the distance there. The bright yellow is a rape growing and producing a rather scenic effect. And the one thing that slowed the Prussians up the most in this area was that flanking fire from the artillery on that hilltop. But over here to the right, to the east, the Prussians had General von Wrangel's brigade of Goebbels' division coming against the Austrian troops on the far side of this rail line, on the north side of the rail line. The 35th Jaeger Battalion and Colonel von Nobili's brigade made their defense up there. The remainder of the Austrian line here was to our rear in the Fasanery Garden, while the Austrian left, Nobili's brigade fought against Wrangel's troops to the north side of the railroad line. The bulk of the Austrian division, 3 other brigades, Reichach, Hesse, and Bernhardt, were located here in the Fasanery Garden, just east of Aschaffenburg. The attackers on this side of the rail line was General Kummer's Prussian brigade. Goebbels' division consisted of those 2 brigades here in the Fasanery, which is still today, as you can see, an attractive location. Battle here lasted about an hour. There was a lot of tree-to-tree fighting as the Austrians were pushed back towards the city with its old medieval city walls. It may be worth mentioning that these particular Austrian troops did not fight as hard as they might otherwise have done. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a multinational empire, and these particular men, enlisted men, were not ethnic Germans at all. They were Italians from what was then still the Austrian province of Venetia. Every one of those enlisted men must have known that at that very same instant, the Kingdom of Italy, allied with Prussia, was fighting against the Austrian Empire to liberate Venetia from Austrian rule. And so we can assume that their morale and their esprit was not as high as it would otherwise have been. But still, they put up a fight for about an hour and were driven back towards the city. As it turned out, it was not a good idea to try to defend on this east bank of the Main River, this far from the city, and we'll soon see why. Suburbs of Aschaffenburg is the Austro-Hungarian War Memorial to this particular battle. Put up in 1866 and 67. The inscription says, "To the memory of the Imperial and Royal Austrian officers and men who fell here on the 14th of July, 1866. It's a bit weathered, but perhaps a few people back in the homeland of these troops might still come here occasionally, if their ancestors were part of this battle. Note the double-headed Habsburg eagle above the inscription. This is the Heerstall Turm, and it's the one small remaining portion of the original Heerstaller Tor, part of the city gates of what was in 1866 still the walled city of Aschaffenburg. The Austrians had given battle out beyond those walls with the walls to their back, and this gateway was the only way back through the city. What happened when they were beaten in the Fasanery is that the Prussians were able to get men around their flanks and to seize this gateway, trapping many of the Austrians against the city walls. When the battle ended, they were able to take nearly 1,800 Austrians prisoner. Other Prussians were able to pass on through the city and seize the one bridge over the Main River, which meant that even more Austrians were taken prisoner as they tried to flee their defeat. In total, there had been 9,000 Austrians engaged in this battle against about 13,000 of General von Goebbels' Prussians. The Prussian casualties were remarkably light, only 177 killed and wounded. The Austrians had suffered 480 killed and wounded. As usual, the Prussian needle gun made the big difference there. But also, a total of 1,900 Austrians were taken prisoner. So once more, the Western German 8th Corps fought piecemeal, fought with only one of its divisions, and yet again suffered a defeat. This is the old Baroque palace in Aschaffenburg. This was the summer residence of the archbishops of Mainz back in the days when they ruled this area. And on the evening of the battle, General von Falkenstein occupied this palace as his quarters, and during the next day, the 15th of July, gave his men and officers a 24-hour rest. It was in this palace then that he threw a victory banquet for his officers the evening after the battle had taken place. At the same time, down in the courtyard below the palace, and down here near the Main River, the hundreds and hundreds of Austrian prisoners waited under guard, obviously taking no part in the festivities, which they could hear from the great building up above them. But on the day after this party, the Prussian units had to continue their march towards Frankfurt. By this time, the way to Frankfurt was wide open. Prince Alexander's 8th Corps troops had headed southeast towards a link-up with their Bavarian allies. The Prussians had simply a steady march to make to arrive at Frankfurt. We're in the heart of downtown Frankfurt, and this scene would have looked, I think, dramatically different on the 16th of July in 1866, when the Prussians marched into this point. But this is indeed the commercial heart of modern Frankfurt, and if we do a quick scan of this famous Hauptwache square, you can certainly see that that's the case. In those days, the free city of Frankfurt was the seat of German commerce, industry, of the German middle class, of business and industry, of freedom of thought, and of all those things that the Prussians, or at least the Prussian Junkers, looked on with contempt. The Prussian army marched in from that direction late in the evening, about 7 p.m. on the 16th of July. They were led by cavalry patrols of hussars and cuirassiers. They came down the Rossmarkt, past that church that you see there, to the Hauptwache. Frankfurt had its own little battalion, almost more an honorary force than anything else, and they had not taken part in the campaign up to this point. And on this evening, they were drawn up in full dress uniform to do a formal surrender to the Prussians. The Prussians, with Vogel von Falkenstein at their head, treated them with contempt, ignored them, left them standing in ranks for several hours while they occupied this part of town, took possession of the key buildings, began moving their troops into quarters in private homes of the more affluent citizens. And only after about 2 hours did a young lieutenant deign to tell the Frankfurt battalion that they could go on back to their quarters. That's how they were going to treat the city of Frankfurt, and things only got worse after that. The Prussians remained here for 5 days, resting, recuperating, incorporating reinforcements into their armies. They'd done a pretty vigorous campaign up to this point. And during those 5 days, they treated this city with studied brutality. They imposed massive financial fines on the Frankfurt business community. They definitely showed Frankfurt that they were going to treat it with contempt. It was the one part of Germany that was the most free of Prussian influence, but all that was about to end. This is the Tauber River, and it does not look like much of a militarily significant obstacle. But on July 24th, 1866, Prince Alexander of Hesse had his units lined up defending along this river line. His Bavarian allies were somewhere to the north of him, not too cooperative, but at least they were there someplace. Here at Tauberbischofsheim was the southern end of his defensive line. And this town was being held by the Württemberg division, about 12,000 men altogether. So here, once again, you had the same problem as at least 2 other times in this campaign of defending a river line against the attacking Prussians who would be coming from that direction. The Württembergers put only a small detachment into the town itself, the far side of the river. They didn't make the mistakes the Austrians had done at Aschaffenburg of putting all their eggs in that basket. What they did do was to hold back 2 of their 3 brigades in the hills to the east, behind Tauberbischofsheim, ready to use them to reinforce or to maneuver or to retreat, whichever became necessary. The Prussians attacked from the west, coming down from the direction ultimately of Frankfurt. And about noon on the 24th of July, lead elements of General Goering's division appeared on those hills in the distance beyond the town. They fought this battle with only a single brigade, General Wrangel's 7,000 men. The other brigade was 2 miles further north, capturing a bridgehead against the Baden troops. But the town itself was seized rather readily by Wrangel's Prussians. The small Württemberg detachment was quickly chased out across the predecessor of this bridge. What you then had was the battle settling down to a firefight over the Tauber River between the Prussians on that bank And the Württembergers on this far bank, the eastern side, in which first one and then another of their brigades moved down to the riverbanks, tried to launch attacks across the river, but were beaten back by the devastating fire of the Prussian needle guns. By 3:30 in the afternoon, the battle was at its height. About 4 o'clock, there was a half-hour lull in the battle in which only the artillery pieces on these hills overlooking the town had a lot to say. About 4:30, General von Hardeg's 3rd Brigade made its attempt to take the bridge, and again was halted by the devastating fire of the Prussians. By this time, the Prussians on this far bank called up their remaining battalions, held back in reserve, and sent them forward to seize their own bridgehead, wading across the Tauber River with great ease. To seize this eastern side of the river and gaining a precarious bridgehead right about here. They couldn't do much more. They were certainly outnumbered, and even with their firepower, they had accomplished a great deal. They hung on to this bridgehead against the Württemberg unit's counterattacks coming down from the hills that you see in the distance until evening, until sunset, until the Württembergers had had enough and began pulling back. General von Hardeg, the division commander, finally withdrew his troops to the hills east of town. By 7:30 in the evening, the battle was over. Prince Alexander, the army commander, brought up his Austrian division to cover the withdrawal of the Württembergers. One reason they pulled back so readily was that they had been outflanked. The Prussians farther north along the Tauber had rather easily captured bridgeheads against the division of Baden troops, who retreated with great enthusiasm. So here it was the Württembergers' turn to fight their battle, isolated and unsupported. Each component of the Western German troops had to fight separately. In this case, the Württembergers put up a good fight, withdrew in good order, but still the Prussians had been too much for them. Here's where the entire campaign came to an end. Between the 24th and 26th of July, there had been 3 days of battle. The Prussian 3 divisions had advanced on a 14-mile front, 20 miles between the Tauber and the Main rivers. And here at Würzburg, the Bavarian and the Western German forces were now reduced to simply a huddled mass of almost 100,000 men on the far side of the river. What you see there is the famous Marienberg fortress, the old medieval fortress of the Prince Bishops of Würzburg, overlooking the city from the west bank of the Main. And that old fortress was the one remaining toehold on this side, and the one remaining military gesture the Prussians had to do was to bombard it, which they did do on the 27th of July from this position that we're standing on. General von Manteuffel had brought his troops up to the Main River. He unlimbered 4 batteries of artillery, 24 guns, and opened fire about 12:30 in the afternoon of the 27th. The guns in the fortress returned fire without a tremendous amount of effect. At one point, the Prussian guns had to displace because of the return fire and move elsewhere. And if you want to consider that the last victory of the armies of the German Confederation, you're welcome to, but it surely was not much of a victory. By 4 p.m., the Prussian artillery had ceased firing temporarily, without much effect on the fortress. One spectacular thing, though, was that the arsenal in the old fortress had been set ablaze. It burned on into the night with huge leaping billows of flame. Spectacular, but not really as destructive as it seemed to be. Late that afternoon, Allied representatives appeared from the German Confederate troops on the far side of the river. Prince Karl of Bavaria had received a telegram from his prime minister about the peace negotiations going on at Nikolsburg in Austria. An armistice was supposed to have been signed at this point. Prussian commander von Manteuffel toughed it out, said that he hadn't heard anything about such an armistice, and refused to agree to a formal ceasefire. Within the next day, however, he relented, and again, these shots at the Marienberg were the final ones of the campaign. This brought an end to the events of July 1866 and to the campaign of the Army of the Main, a classic example of the principles of war.